Millions of copies of the Book of Mormon have been printed over the years, but this volume of the Joseph Smith Papers will be the first time that the full color images of each page of the Printers Manuscript of the Book of Mormon will be available for members and scholars alike.
Coming up next on History of the Saints, the Joseph Smith Papers, Revelations and Translations, Volume 3. Welcome to this History of the Saints special presentation. Of all the documents and artifacts precious to the Latter-day Saints, perhaps none is more valuable than this one, the Printers Manuscript of the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the longest and most complete revelation of the Lord Jesus Christ in recorded history. And now, for the first time, scholars and laymen alike will have the opportunity to study this manuscript of the Book of Mormon as close to its original as they possibly can, just as Oliver Cowdery and the Scribes wrote it.
The Joseph Smith Papers has 6 series that it publishes. One of those series is the Revelations and Translations series. We've published already several volumes of the Revelations, now found in the Doctrine and Covenants. This volume, the 3rd volume of that series, publishes essentially the entire text of the Book of Mormon in manuscript form. And it's a facsimile edition, and that means on one side of a spread is a color facsimile photograph of the original manuscript, and then the other spread has the typescript of that document. So what we have here is unprecedented access to this early manuscript that not everyone can see of the Book of Mormon text.
Revelations and Translations, Volume 3, contains the Printer's Manuscript of the Book of Mormon. So what is the Printer's Manuscript and where did it come from?
Joseph Smith, following the loss of the manuscript by Martin Harris, was not sure what to do. He prayed, his family were concerned, and then a young man by the name of Oliver Cowdery came down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Joseph and his wife Emma were living. Joseph knew immediately that this individual was the man that would help him bring forth the Book of Mormon. So Joseph Smith began to dictate the Book of Mormon text to Oliver Cowdery, and Oliver Cowdery wrote down essentially much of the Book of Mormon text on manuscript. We sometimes forget today, in the ease of printers and Xerox machines and whatnot, that producing a text hundreds of pages long is an arduous process. Oliver Cowdery spent hours each day handwriting the Book of Mormon. This manuscript, known as the original manuscript, is that first effort that Joseph Smith took to place the Book of Mormon in English language. When Joseph and Oliver and other scribes were finished with the translation in the summer of 1829, Joseph Smith, likely understanding the ease in which manuscripts could be lost, told Oliver Cowdery to recopy the entire Book of Mormon manuscript.
Oliver began in August of 1829 making the copy. He first made 24 pages. They were 6 large sheets folded and then written on, so you ended up with 24 pages, 12 leaves, 6 folded sheets. It's called a gathering, and he took this to Grandin's print shop, and John Gilbert proceeded to set the type late August, and so they started the work of the typesetting. It's important to realize several things. That one reason for the printer's manuscript is that Joseph was worried that if they only had one manuscript and they took that into the press, the print shop, it might get lost. And of course, Joseph had learned from the 116 pages, I'd better have a copy, a backup. So they made the copy and they took it in.
Imagine Oliver Cowdery spent all this time creating this original manuscript, and then he's asked to recopy the entire thing. I can't think of how many hand cramps Oliver Cowdery must have suffered. But he created this second copy the second manuscript, 465 pages long. And this became known as the Printers Manuscript because it was this manuscript that went into the printing office in which they set the type for the publication of the Book of Mormon. So when we look at today the printed copy of the Book of Mormon, that printed copy largely can be traced to this Printers Manuscript.
Now, the copy was not made all at once. It was made as they needed copy. And the evidence suggests that they started in August of 1829 with the first 24 pages, the first gathering of the Printer's Manuscript. And it seems like they finished the Printer's Manuscript, completed it in the latter part of January 1830.
Oliver Cowdery is using what's called foolscap paper. It's much bigger than your 8x11 size paper. And in fact, generally, it's quite lengthy that you fold in half so that you have essentially 2 leaves folded together, 4 pages. And it's fairly long. It's a little bit larger than your legal size paper, so 8x14. And of course, Oliver Cowdery is using quill pens. Steel-tipped nibs are available at this time, but they're a new technology, so usually you stick with what you're used to, and Oliver Cowdery seems to be using a quill pen. You have to cut your own nib with pen knives. You have to hand dip it in ink that you're likely making yourself, and Oliver Cowdery is undergoing this tedious process.
Why does this volume contain the Printer's Manuscript of the Book of Mormon and not the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, scribed by Oliver Cowdery between April 7th, 1829 and June 1st of 1829?
The Printer's Manuscript is a copy. It's a copy of the original manuscript. For recovering the earliest text of the Book of Mormon, the Printer's Manuscript is overall our best source. The reason for this is that the original manuscript, the one that the scribes wrote down as Joseph Smith dictated it, is only about 28% extant. Joseph Smith placed the original in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, and it was taken out. That was in 1841, and 41 years later, Louis Bideman, second husband of Emma's, removed it, and water had gotten in, and mold, and most of the manuscript was destroyed. But he was able to retrieve probably 30% of the original, and we have about 28% of that left. 25 of the 28 is in our church archives. So we have the original, and we're very glad to have what we do have. We wish we had the whole thing, but we don't.
There are some pages that have survived largely from the top of the manuscript, so First Nephi and parts of Alma have survived. But much of that did not survive. About 28% of that manuscript exists. And we on the Joseph Smith Papers felt that it was important to present the entire text of the Book of Mormon first. And so we went with the Printer's Manuscript, and we're presenting that as the complete text of the Book of Mormon so that scholars will have the entire narrative, the entire story of the Book of Mormon. And then a subsequent volume will have the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon it will be difficult to present, but there will be the fragments, and users can see how difficult it is for scholars to piece together the text from these inches by inches of manuscript fragments.
Joseph Smith did not dictate punctuation in the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. Thus, Oliver Cowdery didn't copy punctuation into the Printer's Manuscript. Revelations and Translations, Volume 3, will showcase the marvelous contribution of John H. Gilbert, not the least of which was punctuation.
It's very subtle, but punctuation plays an important part of reading any text. There isn't a reason why punctuation was incorporated in the first place in the medieval manuscripts. And I think to that degree, John Gilbert plays an important role in the Book of Mormon text. Here he is presented this manuscript. It has virtually no punctuation, and he is reading it as one unfamiliar not only with the text itself, but unfamiliar with Joseph and others and kind of the context in which this text was brought forth. So he's doing the very best he can in trying to make sense of this manuscript. And in that degree, he is the one that ends sentences. He's the one that adds pauses to phrases. He's the one that decides between a semicolon and a comma, or a semicolon and a period. And I will be the first to admit, most of that doesn't matter. But there are some instances where that does matter. And I find it ironic to some degree that we have a non-Mormon who was at the time, I don't know if he was antagonistic, but he was certainly ambivalent towards the movement. He is the one that is, to a large degree, making sense of the Book of Mormon text. And it's through that punctuation that we have the text itself. He spent, back in those days, 10, 12-hour days were common. He wanted to take the manuscript home with him to punctuate it by candlelight, so that by the next morning he would have a fully punctuated manuscript and it would be easier to set the type. Well, initially they refused. They were very concerned about losing the manuscript and they did not want to leave it out of their sight. So if he punctuated the manuscript, Gilbert had to do it in the office, which took away from the valuable time that he could be setting the type. Well, Gilbert must have pressed them several times and they finally agreed. Gilbert remembers taking the manuscript home and he was able to punctuate some of that manuscript. He says in ink. And we do have in the manuscript portions of 2nd Nephi where we have chapters of Isaiah where the punctuation is indeed done in ink.
It does appear that they would go in with manuscript, that it would be necessary, and it would be probably in the evening when they would get back. When Oliver was there at the press all day long, as they were, so he would probably do his copy work at night when he would get back. So it's not surprising that he might have gotten tired sometimes. It was quite laborious, and this scribe too takes over for him. Does about, I believe, 14% of the printer's manuscript.
There's another scribe that works in the manuscript, and I wish I could tell you the name, but we don't know who it is. It's the unknown scribe. I kind of like the fact that there's an unknown scribe in the Book of Mormon manuscript. It's similar to an unmarked grave or the grave of the unknown soldier. To a certain degree, we can insert anyone in that place.
There are differences between the modern printed text of the Book of Mormon and the printer's manuscript of the same. Why is this?
Well, I think an important thing to keep in mind is that the entire transmission of the text, except for what Joseph Smith has seen, is being done by humans who can make mistakes, can get tired, and they have to catch their errors. I think some people sometimes have the idea that the Lord is intervening to make sure no mistakes occur, but this isn't the case. And I think that is important. There aren't any huge errors, but even sometimes, occasionally, the typesetter would skip a part of a verse because his eye skipped down. And we've now discovered some of those kinds of errors. As far as I can tell, even Joseph Smith, he's looking in the instrument. He has got to read it off correctly. The scribe's got to hear it correctly. The scribe's got to write it correctly. Then they'll copy it correctly, we hope. The typesetter will set it correctly, we hope. Editors will make the right decisions and so forth. We pretty much, everyone's always tried to do their best.
The Book of Mormon has had relatively little change, a little substantive change. There are several instances of modernized language or clarifying bad grammar or introducing clarification that is not at all substantive.
We don't really have any drastic errors. Contrary to the Tanners in their book on 3,913 changes in the Book of Mormon, these are mostly grammatical changes. They even count typos being corrected as changes in the Book of Mormon. That shows they're not being really forthright in their counting. But even then, there are only a couple places where a doctrinal issue was sort of messed up a little. Nothing to, really cause trouble, But it's interesting that the original reading is fully doctrinally correct, and the mistake made is a minor one. The one that I think of is the original text. Alma tells Corianton that he is to return to the Zoramites and to acknowledge his fault and repair the wrong which he has done. But Oliver mistakenly copied repair as retain the wrong which you have done. And Brother Talmage in 1920 couldn't figure out how it should be retained, so he just took it out. So the current text reads that Corianton's supposed to go back and acknowledge his fault and the wrong which he has done. He's just supposed to say he's sorry. The original text says, no, he's supposed to not only say he's sorry, but he's to repair it. He's supposed to do something. Well, that's the true doctrine of repentance. And there's another one, it's a minor one too. There aren't doctrinal changes, and there aren't really changes in the story, you know. The Queen Lamoni, or the Queen of King Lamoni, when she comes out of her trance, the original text says she clapped her hands, but the typesetter misread clapped as clasp, so it's got clasp. Well, does that make a real big difference? Not really, but it does mean that she was more Pentecostal. You know, clasping your hand is sort of meek, but clapping your hands, she's got the Spirit.
There have been exorbitant claims made over the years that the Book of Mormon has been radically altered from its original. Well, that's not true. Any and all now who care to see what changes have been made in the Book of Mormon can now, through Revelations and Translations, Volume 3, see for themselves what's been changed. The most substantive changes were made by the prophet Joseph Smith himself, and the reason for that is a fascinating story. It begins with the decision to publish a new edition of the Book of Mormon in 1837.
Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery read through the entire text of the Book of Mormon in preparation for the 1837 edition. Joseph Smith himself is marking up the manuscript, this Printers Manuscript, and we've indicated those markups in bold. So anytime in the transcription you see a word or a punctuation in bold, that's Joseph Smith himself making the change.
So there aren't these kinds of changes that sometimes people like to make out that are just outrageous and so forth. Most of them are grammatical. Joseph Smith changed which to who over 900 times. Our Father which art in heaven, he changed to our Father who art in heaven. Well, in most languages, which and who are the same relative pronoun. It doesn't even make any difference. So the most common change Joseph Smith made won't even show up in translations most of the time. So, in fact, very few languages. So I just find so much of these arguments about changes not very interesting. When they came to set the type for the 1837, they used that marked up 1830 as their source for doing the typesetting. They didn't set the 1837 from the Printers Manuscript again. But Oliver had the Printers Manuscript. He would have had it in the press in case they needed to check something, and it was then used as a reference.
There were other changes made by the prophet Joseph Smith. For example, if you read the Printer's Manuscript today, you would come to 1 Nephi 4:4, where it reads, "They was yet wroth," or Helaman 13:37, which reads, "This shall be your language in them days."
They was yet wroth, and in them days are in the text, they're in the Printer's Manuscript. But we are now discovering that language is not necessarily upstate New York dialect. People have automatically assumed this, but we have found it in, as I've indicated, early modern English in the 1600s. In them days was in academic writing. So maybe this text, maybe they've kept the pure language, you know?
So Joseph Smith made the decision to modernize or standardize some of the English in preparation for the 1837 edition, even though that English may have been proper in times before. This new volume allows a reader to see those changes, to study, ponder, and make a decision for themselves.
I think Joe Smith made the right decision. For the standard text of members of the church, it needs to be in a more standard English. However, for those who are really interested in the text, and we can give a context for what's going on, I think it's just wonderful to see it closer to how it was actually given. So I'll take both, and I don't have a problem with having both.
This is unprecedented access to not only how the manuscript looks, but what the text actually contains. The volume also contains an important introduction to not only the manuscript, the history of the manuscript, but also the story of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. From 1827 to 1837, we have this very important history of the plates, the translation, the 1830 edition and its publication, the 1837 and its edition. What we really have here in this volume is a critical story of the founding of an American religion.
The closer you get back, the more you see the hand of God in these things, despite the fact that they might have misspelled things or whatever. You see the word of the Lord being transmitted by real people in real time with their own spellings, and I love it that way.